Sir, can I get your first and last name, please?
This presentation shows a workflow in action. This particular workflow is a lab draw for a patient being seen in the ER and is depicted in a swim lane diagram where each step of the workflow is identified by the medical staff performing the action. The first demonstration depicts a workflow that's not optimal. It contains elements that may increase errors. The second presentation shows how the same workflow has been improved by changing some of the steps. As you watch the presentations, look for the corresponding key steps outlined in the workflow diagrams. In the swim lane diagram of the lab draw workflow, a medical administrative assistant, or MAA, completes intake on the patient. The MAA creates a wristband, confirms information on the wristband, and places it on the patient for admission to the ER. After the intake's completed, a triage nurse then transports the patient to a stretcher or exam room. Once the patient is in an exam room, a medical provider, typically a physician, examines the patient, learns the symptoms and health history, and determines the need for any labs. If labs are needed, the physician then writes the orders on the workflow sheet. To initiate the lab draw, the physician then gives the nurse the lab draw order for entry into CPRS, the computerized patient record system. The nurse then enters the order and prints the labels for the lab specimen tubes. After receiving the order to collect labs from a specific patient, the health tech goes to the patient's exam room, confirms the patient's identity, and draws the labs. Once this step is completed, the health tech places the unlabeled specimen tubes in an emesis basin. Once all labs are drawn, the health tech then goes to the printer, picks up labels that the nurse printed out, and labels the specimen tubes. The labeled specimen tubes are then transported to the lab for processing. Now let's look at the same workflow, this time focusing on the workflow that has been optimized to decrease the chance of error. In the original workflow, the health tech first draws the blood, then picks up the labels. However, did you notice that he didn't check to make sure he picked up the right labels? Carrying around unlabeled specimen tubes can increase the chances that the tubes will be mislabeled. To optimize the workflow, before the health tech enters the patient's room to do the lab draw, he should first pick up the labels from the printer that were printed after the nurse entered the lab draw order into CPRS. The health tech then goes to the patient's room, confirms the patient's identity, and begins the blood draw. Having the labels with him in the patient's room allows the health tech to label the tubes immediately after drawing the blood, minimizing the opportunities for mislabeled or misplaced specimen tubes.